Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you to those of us who have joined in. We'll get this going pretty quickly because I'm pretty sure no one is here to hear me. I do want to thank SAIS for allowing us to work with the students again on another practicum. From the perspective of the Mobility Foundation, this issue of equity and the role it plays in figuring out how we should be engaged with our projects and the design of those projects is really fundamental. And as the team has uncovered, and don't let the elegance to which they explain the work in any way hide the fact that it was a very complex and challenging problem. This is not an easy issue to deal with, the issues of how you build in equity across many metrics into the design of these large-scale mobility projects and the implication it has on energy and the ability for people to move. So I do want to thank the team for their work. It's been a pleasure over the last 8 months or so, and even more so given an unusual set of circumstances where they lost half the team, and then I still think managed to produce a report that will stand up against the best that this program has produced. So they'll talk about the work that they've done for about half an hour, and then we'll invite a couple other people up, Dr. Blair Ruble, who's a fellow at the Wilson Center, and Claire Casey, who's the managing partner at Foreign Policy Analytics, and also a fairly recent SAIS alum as well. So we'll get involved with the discussion after hearing their comments, and then of course you're here to participate as well, so please prepare your questions and we'll have a very fruitful engagement. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lubna and Antonio to start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, William, and good afternoon, everyone. Antonia and I are the Toyota Mobility Fund Practicum team, and for the last 8 months, we've been studying social equity in public transit. So let me just take you through why. First of all, transit isn't designed equally for everyone. Some people are safer than others. Women tend to be more unsafe because of the design of public transit. Secondly, transportation planning usually favors motorized transport, which means that people who drive cars are able to access more opportunities than people who are reliant on public transit. Third, a lot of heavy reliance on motorized transport creates a lot of negative externalities, the brunt of which is faced by low-income groups that tend to be working or living close to the roads. And fourth, in recent years, we have found that jobs are moving away from high-poverty locations. This means locations that have a concentration of vulnerable groups have less and less access to opportunity. The point we're trying to make is that equity considerations are unavoidable in the context of public transit. Public transit affects different groups differently. So we should be thinking about equity when we design public transit. Unfortunately, most equity impact analyses are conducted after the fact and do not get accounted for upfront. This leads to increased costs and leads to a widening of the disadvantage of vulnerable groups. This is why the question we wanted to answer with Toyota was, how can we plan public transit that improves social equity?
Which brings us to the next section, the research scope. A full equity analysis can be expensive and takes up a long time. Therefore, we wanted to come up with a framework that includes a range of equity considerations from the beginning. To do this, we conducted this study. Because of Toyota's global coverage, we focused on our research on metropolitan public transit systems worldwide. We wanted to focus on the interaction between public transit and social equity and make equity central to the planning and project appraisal process. For this reason, the presentation is intended for planners and policymakers to plan interventions to improve equity. Lastly, to conduct the research, we used mainly secondary data and studies and adapted lessons from impact evaluations. So this brings us to our agenda. We divided our presentations into 3 different sections. First, we will clarify what is equity and why does it matter. Second, we will answer the question, how can we account for equity? In doing so, we will take you through the various dimensions of equity, which include economic inclusions and its various subsets, gender, safety, and accessibility. The central question we want to answer is this intervention going to be equity improving? Lastly, we will provide recommendations of how we can account for equity in the planning phase. So, we want to start with what is equity and why does it matter? What is equity? The idea of equity comes from the political and philosophical idea of social justice, in particular distributive justice. Equity is about the distribution of transportation benefits and costs among current and future members of society. We can think of equity in two different ways. Horizontal equity, which you find on the left-hand side, concerns the distribution of impacts between individuals and groups considered equal. For example, a system that treats everyone equal is a system that charges everyone equal. So passengers get what they pay for and pay for what they get. Vertical equity, which we can see on the right-hand side, is about the distribution in costs and benefits between groups that are different. For example, a system that treats people unequally would have subsidies for people that are disadvantaged. For this research, we want to highlight vertical equity. The key here is that we need a disaggregated analysis to capture equity impacts. This is why we emphasize on vulnerable subgroups of the population. So, why do planners miss equity considerations? As Lubna highlighted before, planning often favorizes motorized transport, which means cities are maybe designed to suit cars over public transit. This is the most prominent here in the United States. Second, disadvantaged groups are often not consulted when new transit interventions are designed. Furthermore, barriers to accessing public transit are not clearly understood before planning a new intervention. Third, planners and policymakers tend to be from very specific subgroups, which are often middle to high income males, which means that the planning group does not represent the diverse need of the population. Fourth, project appraisals focus on quantifiable factors. The cost equity analysis is the most commonly used appraisal method in this process. Sometimes other considerations like environmental impacts are added on, but there is no standard protocol for evaluating these impacts. And lastly, funding. Decisions are strongly driven by monetary considerations. As highlighted before, conducting an equity analysis upfront will increase cost and might lead to design changes that require high investments. This may be the biggest reason that equity is overlooked. So, why aren't all equity improving public transit systems funded by the government? That was another question we were working on. Well, the big problem is public transit is expensive. Given the economic conditions of a country, the public sector does not always have the budget for public transit projects. In this environment, pure private partner sector ownerships and public-private partnerships have become increasingly popular. However, public and private sectors have naturally different priorities and might differ in their objectives and definition of success. We tried to illustrate this in this picture, where we show the different preferences on the slide. So on the left-hand side, we can see that the public sector mostly focuses on social welfare and public interest, whereas on the right-hand side, the private sector mainly focuses profitability. And somewhere in the middle, we find public-private partnerships. While none of these priorities are inherently bad or good, it matters how you plan and implement these projects. This brings me to my next question. Why aren't all equity improving public transit systems funded by PPPs? With the growing interest in PPPs, the debate over their proper use has become somewhat polarized. In the short run, PPPs might help the government offset funding problems, but if they are poorly designed and ultimately fail, the risk falls back to the government, which leads to increased government spending. And how do countries offset increased government spending? By increasing taxes, which means the burden might fall back on taxpayers in the long run. So what do we know? Experiences worldwide about PPP failures converge into the same essential elements, and I chose to highlight 3 of them. The first, poor public sector capacity, which can lead to a poor legal framework and enforcement. Second, inappropriate PPP and sector frameworks, which among other things affects risk allocation. And third, unrealistic revenue and cost estimations, which can be too high or too low. So what should we do? First, the public sector cannot assume that the private sector will act in interest of the public in a PPP. Therefore, legislation plays a key role in protecting interest throughout the decision-making process. Second, guidelines for private sector and PPP programs, procurements, projects, and contracts should be set. Third, transparency and public participation in the planning process are necessary in order to avoid surprises, more or less. And fourth, a firm monitoring framework to closely watch project activities pre and after implementation should be developed. In sum, PPPs can be a valuable option for countries that are seeking innovative approaches and funding for public transit systems. However, PPPs are only viewed as one piece of the funding puzzle, as states address overall transportation needs. Whatever the method of financing, we believe that equity should be a part of the project appraisal. Therefore, Lubna will now answer the question of how we can account for equity.
To answer the question, I'm going to walk you through the different dimensions of equity that we covered in our report, starting with user fees, employment, land value and gentrification, gender, safety, and then accessibility. The question we're trying to answer in each dimension is, can we know whether this intervention will be equity improving or not? The equity dimensions are not meant to be mutually exclusive, but we've chosen them so that they cover the whole range of equity impacts. So for the first impact, user fees, the mechanism at play here is simple. High user fees can block low-income groups from accessing transit, which spatially limits them and doesn't allow them to access the full range of employment opportunities and services. What we found in terms of setting user fees is that there is no universal standard for affordable transit. In other sectors like water and sanitation, for example, you have a well-established universal benchmark of 5% for affordability. No such benchmark exists for transit. What we recommend in this case is to set an affordability benchmark for the city and disaggregate it by income. This means, for example, that people earning the minimum wage or people in the lowest quartile should not be spending more than a certain percentage, say between 5 and 10% on public transit. Second, in estimating user fees, there is almost never a needs assessment that covers non-users of transport. To cover this, we recommend that the needs of non-users be estimated at the start, and importantly, to understand whether there is a cost barrier to accessing transit. The next factor is employment. Employment can be affected by public transit in two ways, either because of how affordable or unaffordable it is, and where the public transit can take people. The key here being that jobs and demographic characteristics are unevenly distributed across the cities. The important subgroup characteristics to highlight here are transit-dependent populations who would require transit to access the full range of services, including employment. Second, people who have multiple jobs or are switching between many short-term employment options tend to value living close to transport much more than people who have one steady source of income. Third, most of the employment disadvantaged groups tend to have intersecting vulnerabilities. This could be because they are female, low income, come from minority communities, or have low levels of education. One of the most important findings in terms of employment was that integrated city planning, where you can switch from different modes of transport easily, provided the highest accessibility gains to such individuals. What we recommend needs to be done at the beginning of the planning process is a spatial mapping that's disaggregated by income groups. This helps to establish where the communities of concern lie within the city and where the job concentrations lie. For example, the central business district usually has a concentration of the high-income jobs. In San Diego, for example, the commuter rail is found to be used by the high-class professional workers that access the central business district, while the light rail, the trolley, is used by the middle-income workers to access more distributed employment opportunities. Importantly, integrated city development has the largest accessibility gains, and this is something that will be a feature of all the equity dimensions we cover. The next aspect is land value and gentrification. Land value is notoriously difficult to estimate upfront, land value changes. What we found on average is that proximity to public transit is positively correlated with land value. But to explain the variation in outcomes, what we found in the literature is that the four most important aspects that it depends on are distance from the transit station, the key distance here being about 200 to 800 meters from the station. Under 200 meters, there's a nuisance effect which may cause prices to either stay the same or depreciate. Second, preference for public transit. This works easily if you compare a place like Tokyo to a place like Boston or LA. A study that did that found that because of the very low preference for public transit in the United States, it is not very common for large land value appreciation, whereas in places like Tokyo, where the experience with public transit is good, it tends to lead to larger land value appreciation. Third, system quality. The mechanism is similar to preference for public transit. In Seoul, in Korea, post the upgradation of the BRT system, land values appreciated despite no other changes to the system. And most importantly, micro context and city development. For example, in Vancouver or Toronto, the SkyTrain was extended into low-income suburbs outside the city. And this didn't lead to gentrification in the traditional sense. This actually increased poverty in the neighborhoods surrounding the transit lines. This can be seen as a positive development and is a result of low market demand in that region, which prevents the price from being bid up and people from being displaced. Gentrification is one of the most important channels through which land value can affect equity. What we found in the literature is that there is a very wide variation in gentrification impacts, ranging from increasing concentration of vulnerable groups, like in Vancouver, to decreasing concentration of vulnerable groups, like in San Francisco. What we found matters most importantly is integrated city planning. A way to address mapping the impact channels for land value and gentrification changes is again a spatial analysis. This should be disaggregated in terms of the income groups and specifically whether people are renting or owning apartments. This is the most important for people to map gentrification impacts. Now moving on to gender. The sexual division of labor, unfortunately, is alive and well today. The World Development Report confirms that women still perform a disproportionately higher number of household work and care work. What this means is women take a larger number of short and low-value trips to conduct household-related activities. This means that the way they use transit is different from men. A system, for example, that favors single long trips would be beneficial to someone who just has to commute to and from work, but not from someone who has to do the shopping, pick up the children, and come all the way back home. In this way, systems that are designed to suit single long trips can further disadvantage women. Because of this, women tend to be time poor, and so any savings in terms of a time through public transit is more valuable for women. Encouragingly, what we have found, before I say that, safety concerns are another important factor that dissuade transit use for women. This is common in almost all cities. In Delhi, about 95% women say that their mobility is hampered because of safety concerns. This either manifests itself as a full suppression of demand where people don't use transit at all, which was the case in Dhaka, or in cases where they don't use it at certain times of the day, like the night when safety concerns are at their peak. We have found, however, that women-only spaces can help a great deal in addressing these safety concerns, and simple things like the presence of female staff and the presence of staff in the nighttime can help to assuage safety concerns. Another major important missing feature of the literature was the attention to other gendered minorities. One study in Portland found that a lot of gendered minorities face harassment and violence on public transit, but have no mechanism to report such complaints. So what we recommend should be done about this is to estimate the suppressed demand. An important factor that is often missed out is the use of qualitative surveys. It's missed out because it's more time-consuming and expensive, but as we are arguing, this leads to the design of inequitable systems, and this is a step that should be taken upfront. Finally, transit destinations should be planned such that everyone's needs are taken into account. This could mean either planning destinations so that you can access marketplaces, healthcare centers, and education centers more easily, as opposed to just connecting people to the business districts. And this could also mean in terms of designing the way you charge trips differently. And to improve safety, as I already covered, we can have women-only transit spaces, female staff, mechanisms to respond to violence, and gender sensitivity training, importantly, including non-traditional genders. Fourth, and related, safety. There are regular attacks of violent crimes, robberies, and other assaults that happen on public transit every day. The key here is that safety levels of public transit are spatially distributed across the city. A study in San Francisco found that that mapped safety across the public transit, found that communities that were vulnerable had a higher concentration of crime incidents than did the more affluent communities. This means that safety considerations can block or discourage use and can negatively impact the most vulnerable groups of the population. A spatial mapping here would make sense, and we recommend that this be done at the start to identify the unsafe zones so that expenditure can be targeted in those locations. Simple things like having a staff presence and lighting during the nighttime can also help to prevent small crimes. Accessibility and universal access is a very useful way of framing what we're trying to get at with equity. This forms a sort of repository for the other aspects that we haven't covered so far. The problem is that different groups of the population have different levels of accessibility. We can think of accessibility in two ways. The first being network accessibility, which is how the system itself is designed, and the second being user accessibility. This is something we haven't touched upon yet. The most important way to gauge user accessibility is through a first and last mile analysis. This is about the distance from your house to the transit stop and then from the transit stop to your destination. Improvements in first and last mile usership can be tracked through spatial analysis based on how many places of work and places of residence it gets closer to. While accessibility has been commonly cited as a key indicator, this is never actually incorporated into the planning process, and we recommend methods to do so. These overlap with most of the other factors we've discussed before, which is a spatial mapping to mark the groups with low access, to mark the groups that are vulnerable, and ensure that the system design reaches the groups that have inequitable access. Overall, the gaps we found in the research is a failure to conduct a preliminary needs assessment based on subgrouping. What we've tried to highlight is that different groups will have different sets of disadvantage resulting from the existing system. It is very rare for a needs assessment to be the basis for planning public transit, and we recommend that this should be the first step. Second, there's a failure to evaluate all transit options, the most common being the decision between BRT and light rail. Although they serve very similar purposes and BRT tends to be much cheaper, it's often evaluated against the city's experience with buses and so tends to have a very negative uptake, except in certain regions of the world like Latin America, where because of the positive influence of BRT, they tend to be ubiquitous. Third, they miss the distribution of costs and benefits. While most planners do use a cost-benefit analysis, what is missing from this is the distribution of the costs and benefits. Finally, we believe that there is a failure to identify all the relevant equity impacts at the planning stage. Turning a blind eye to impacts such as land use and gentrification or access to vulnerable populations writes them off as irrelevant to transit planning, while we argue that they should be central to the process. This leads to inequitable transit design. Our recommendation here is that we want to refocus public transit planning to be centered around equity. This means that we want to use public transit as a tool to address vertical inequity and reduce social inequity. And Antonia will walk through our recommendations.
Okay. So the culmination of our report is an equity checklist. It is basically a set of questions on our analysis on each equity dimension, which work together to determine whether the project will be equity improving on the whole. The recommendations are drafted so that each project is evaluated in context of how it interacts with the existing social inequities. This is the structure of our recommendation. On the left side, we can see the questions, and on the right side, we can see the methods in order to answer these questions. We also conducted these for all equity and dimensions, as we can see here, for example, for gender, but these also exist for economic inclusion and so forth and so forth. The key recommendations are, as Lubna mentioned, are centered around what planners can do as a preliminary assessment. The first step is to conduct a baseline scenario. Where data does not exist, this can be done through a rapid social assessment and can be updated periodically. For private companies which may not have regional expertise, it is recommended that social inequities are studied at the regional level. The point of this is to identify what vulnerable groups exist in the region. This might be based on income, ethnicity, religion, and more. There's likely to be a regional variation, so it's recommended that this be done at the scale of the project as far as possible. Next, all stakeholders should be identified. This would include non-users of transit, the target group for which intervention is being planned, and the property owners or renters close to the transit station. Based on the analysis, we explain how to identify potential impact channels. Another step that is commonly missed is the consideration of all transit options, for example, light rail or metro. And lastly, it is important to plan for impact evaluation at the start. This helps to set up data collection channels from the beginning and avoids high costs at the end. So this brings me to our last slide, the overall takeaways. First, an equity checklist should be created during the project appraisal phase. This checklist should include the dimensions that we saw today, which are economic inclusion, accessibility, universal access, gender and safety, and also other impacts which were not covered today but are in our report once it's finished, for example, environmental sustainability. Second, the goal is to check if the interventions are improving equity. This may require more resources in the short term, but will pay off in the long run. Third, a mandated equitable design requirement should be implemented, like, for example, our equity checklist. And fourth, the project appraisal needs to account for trade-offs. For example, this can be done in either two ways. Either by using a minimum requirement for projects, which means that a minimum for each equity dimension would be needed to be met, or by using a maximum red flag approach, which means that the project design should not exceed a maximum amount of red flags. So, our hope is by including equity in public transit planning, the need of disadvantaged groups can be met for a more prosperous future. Which brings us to the end. So thank you for listening to our presentation. And now we would like to invite Claire, Blair, and William to the panel. Yeah, I guess so.
All right. Thank you. We'll start off with asking Blair to share his thoughts and offer some prepared remarks, and then we'll ask Claire to share her thoughts as well, and then we'll open it up for discussion and conversation. And believe if anyone who's online wants to join in, I think we'll be able to patch in or open up the audio as well. Or text or email me, and I'll try and ask the question from here.
Okay. Well, first off, I'd like to thank SAIS and the Toyota Mobility Foundation for inviting me to speak here. I particularly want to thank our authors, Lubna and Antonia. This is a really important report. And it was an impressive presentation. The paper is even more impressive. And I think it's really an honor to have been asked to comment on it. I've been asked to speak for about 10 minutes, and what I thought I would do is, rather than sort of burrow in on some of the specifics, I wanted to underscore why I think the issue of social equity is so important in thinking about mobility. And to do so would bring in a couple of specific examples to further illustrate the general point. I want to do this because I think in general, as the authors have pointed out, equity issues sometimes get short shrift in talking about mobility. And by doing so, we really sell ourselves short. Now, cities are the largest and arguably most complex creation of human beings. And because they're human creations, they're imperfect. And therefore, they require a lot of innovation and creativity to make them work. Too often, when we talk about urban policy, and transportation policy is a good example of this, we conceive of what we're talking about as an engineering problem that has an optimal solution. Once we begin to bring in social equity issues, as we just heard, what we discover is, in fact, maybe there really aren't just engineering issues, but there's a human dimension. And because of that, we need to be more proactive. And this is particularly important with transportation because the projects are so large. They're so large and they're so consequential. Transportation projects are expensive, often the most expensive projects a community will undertake. And equally important, and we don't often think about this, the consequences last for generations. We're baking in patterns of living, and we need to be aware of that. Think of how many cities we know where basic urban morphology has been shaped by rail systems that were conceived of and built a century ago. Or we think about our own area and the importance of the Beltway. The Beltway was conceived of and built a half century ago. And the challenge is we're talking about systems that will serve people who live in totally different ways than we can possibly imagine. And that's the challenge of mobility and mobility planning. Yet at the same time, in reading the paper, I was reminded of experience I had. I was speaking at to a group of urban planning graduate students at a relatively important urban planning program. And after I spoke and I was talking about issues of equity and so on, a student put his hand up and said, "You just don't understand. The challenge is we just don't have the mathematics right. We just haven't figured out the algorithms that capture all the variables we need to capture. And once we do, then planning is going to be wonderful." And I think what this report underscores, and the reason why that came to mind, is we can't get the math right if we're not putting the right factors on the table. And equity needs to be one of the factors that's put on the table. This is really complex. William at the outset talked about how difficult this all is. But we can begin to wrap our minds around the problem by doing things like the authors suggest when they drew up their comprehensive equity checklist, which can help. Now, I want to use one small illustration to highlight how it is if we ask equity questions up front, we can begin to maybe improve the mathematics a little bit. They talk about user fees. They talk today about user fees. It's in the report. And we live at a time when we're moving towards credit-based electronic payment systems of various kinds, and on-demand transportation of various kinds, use of transponders. We all live with this. This is all very efficient. And in some ways, this is an example of getting the math right, except it's dependent upon credit and on credit cards. Now, if we just take the United States, 70% of the American population have credit cards, American adults, but that leaves 75 million who don't. 80% of American whites have credit cards. Okay, you might argue that's more or less complete coverage. Why should we worry about it? Well, 70% of Latinos have credit cards, and about half of African Americans have credit cards. So if you base a payment system of user fees, leaving aside how expensive it is, if you base it on a credit card-based system, you're leaving out 75 million Americans, and you're leaving out half of African Americans. Now, if you think about this up front, you can make some accommodations, and there's been an interesting experiment in Columbus, Ohio, along these lines. But what's important is in planning the Columbus system, which seeks to make on-demand transportation available in poor neighborhoods, that can work because it was thought of up front, and that's why the checklist becomes so important. I want to wrap up my remarks by spending just a little bit of time, and William knows this is my favorite hobby horse, but by talking about a negative example that I think reflects the opposite of everything that we heard about in the report. And it's local. It has the virtue of being a local example, although there are plenty of other examples around the world. I want to say a few words about peak hour pricing on I-66 in Virginia. This is a place where you could argue we got the mathematics right. The goal was to find price points that would drive drivers off of I-66 to alleviate congestion. And, up to $40 tolls do that. And you begin to alleviate congestion on I-66. Moreover, carpools are exempted, which is laudatory, but you need a special transponder in order to demonstrate that you're in a carpool and thereby get the exemption. And that leads back to the credit card issues I was just talking about. But you could say it all has worked in its own terms. It's worked for the politicians who were able to upgrade I-66 without raising taxes, which is the fundamental principle of Virginia politics. This gets into public-private partnerships. Presumably, the company involved is making a profit, or they wouldn't be doing it otherwise. And to be fair to them, that's what they're in business for. But that's exactly why you need to think about this issue up front, so that the public part of the public-private partnership has meaning. It works for drivers with family members and friends and neighbors who have the same mobility patterns that they have because they can carpool. And for those with economic resources that are sufficient to just buy their way out. What it's important to understand is, as beautiful as this model is, it doesn't work for everyone. And we now have the spectacle of drivers pulling off onto the shoulder, waiting for the time when the tolls drop. We have increased congestion on other routes, thereby transferring a lot of the potential deterioration in air quality to other neighborhoods. We have people paying more than the standards which you all set. And I think this brings us back to the fundamental value of what we've been hearing. Viewed in isolation, the I-66 project works. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. It reduced congestion on I-66. But because the assumptions were limited, it has had a deleterious effect on many members of the community. And that, I think, is really what we're hearing in this really wonderful report, which is we need to raise these questions in advance. We need to raise them in advance because it is complicated. And it's not just about getting the math right. You can't get the right math until you ask the right questions. And that is the role of public officials and communities. And this report demonstrates that overall issue very well. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I turn it over to Claire, I've heard Blair speak a couple times now. We've interacted on a number of issues, and I learned something every time, so thank you. So Claire, I'd like to ask you to offer any thoughts or framing questions, and then we'll get into the heart of the discussion.
Great. Thank you, and thanks to SAIS for inviting me back. It's always fun to be here. I haven't, well, actually, I was here last year for this, I guess, but I haven't been here in a long time on a regular basis. And I really want to congratulate Lubna and Antonia for taking on such an incredibly ambitious topic. The scope of this is really tremendous. And I think it would be helpful to give some context to how I look at these issues. So I come at this topic from the perspective of aging and doing a lot of work and research around older adults around the world and how they're engaging with their communities and their ability to continue to be active, productive, and healthy. And it's an interesting overlay because it really addresses so many of the issues they're dealing with, because that's a population that tends to be more likely to be disabled, more likely to be living in poverty, and there are some serious gender issues as well. There were a couple things that I thought were really valuable here, and that stood out to me. The first is the focus on suppressed demand, and not just mapping how people use a system, but how they're not using a system, and the people who are just not even accessing it at all because of a range of factors. And again, the comprehensive nature of the research you did was really terrific. And also focusing on legislation, because if I look at having a checklist is great, and project level work is so important because every community is different and every society has different objectives that they want to match or achieve. But what we've seen looking around the world is unless at the national level there are actual requirements, these things don't happen. And that's just really unfortunate, but true. So you might have a few innovative communities or cities that have a really progressive agenda around equity, but that's more rare than it should be. And so basic things like something like the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is hugely, and we don't give ourselves a lot of credit usually for stuff around infrastructure in this country, but we're actually ahead of the world in accessibility. So you have a country like Germany where most people live within a few hundred meters of public transport, which is fantastic, but they can't actually access it if they have any disabilities. So having actual mandates, I think simple mandates, so choosing a few things that you really do require for all major infrastructure projects is really critical. I think one of the things that was captured in the broader report that unfortunately we didn't all here get the benefit of, but I encourage you to read the report because it's really terrific, is the idea of trade-offs and how complicated these choices really are. And I think the gentrification conversation captured it, because I think we can all say, well, if I want to make sure this community has accessibility to the jobs they might want to, or the healthcare system they might need to access, or the educational opportunities they may want, that also could drive up the land value in their area. So there are really complicated trade-offs here. And so if I made any recommendations for thinking about this stuff going forward, I would say specific policy recommendations for how you can actually operationalize this at the national policy level, not just at the project level, and what can be done at that level, because it's not everything. But that would be a really interesting sort of area for further research or continued conversation. Potentially thinking about simplifying the checklist, which is quite long, and at least in my albeit limited experience, I think that simplicity can often generate better outcomes. Or rather, we always talk about the trade-offs when you're looking at modeling or between parsimony and predictive value. I'm a big believer that you don't necessarily get a dramatic measurable improvement in your outcome with introducing infinite complexity to something that is already a really complicated issue. And the final one was just, you noted, and I thought it was so important, that this really should be part of integrated city planning, because transit is a tool, and it's a powerful tool to address these equity issues. But it's part of a broader toolkit, and it has to be integrated within a broader toolkit. So with issues like gentrification, there are complementary policies around a transit decision that once you do the analysis and you recognize what the potential unintended consequences of a decision, you can build that into a broader plan to make sure that your overall outcome is where your society wants to be going. So I think I'll wrap up with that, and again, just say what a terrific real job you guys did. It's really a really impressive paper.
Thank you. So let me start off the conversation, and of course I said I would make sure the audience has an opportunity as well. If you also read the report, I think they did a very good job of adhering to kind of this fundamental principle that policy is subjective. So there were no value given to what the exact right outcome is. But now we're on a panel and we get to share our opinions and positions. So we're going to open it up to that. The idea behind this was to create that simple, easy framework. So from a policy perspective, how far should we go in terms of trying to achieve equity, right? You touched on it. Is 80% good enough? Is that reasonable to achieve? Should we be looking at 50, 60, 70%? How do we balance these policy factors, and how far should we go in terms of going through the checklist and adding breadth and depth, or just doing a very quick upfront analysis and eliminate bad ideas and move forward with the handful that might be good? Go ahead.
Okay, so I think the issue of trade-offs is really interesting, and we did spend.
Oh, I think you're turned off.
Hello, am I on now? Okay. So, one of the things we did spend time on, and we're still working on structuring it, is the final checklist and the trade-offs. So we were kind of going for repetition, because different aspects we covered in different parts of the report have a lot of repetition. You need to do something at the beginning. You need a needs assessment. There's no way getting around that. I mean, there's no point in trying to save that if you're going to create an inequitable system. So the way we structured it is around the way we divided the dimensions, but perhaps it would be better to have just a list of like steps that can be taken and what needs to be covered in those steps. That would probably be an easier way.
Yeah, I mean, again, absolutely, because you say like the spatial analysis, well, that covers 5 or 6
Exactly.
of these different
Yeah.
issues.
And what we've done right now is include the same steps like spatial analysis, needs assessment under multiple categories, but perhaps like restructure it in terms of the way the planner would go about it. And in terms of a national policy level, things like affordability benchmarks can be set nationally, if not internationally. And those are the kind of things that could be addressed. Universal access is one of them, of course. Some of them are more complicated. How can you make it a matter of policy to consider land value impacts? Integrated city planning comes in there, where it's like, if you identify these impacts, do you have enough leverage to, say, ensure affordable housing or ensure rent controls on those? So those are kind of things that, by maybe having this equity lens, if more projects are using this higher standard, then it becomes more commonplace and it's not such a difficult policy decision. So maybe approaching it from projects stepping up to then policy makers finding it easier to incorporate these changes.
Yeah. Anyone else? Blair, I know you've studied a lot of projects over your history. What are your thoughts on kind of this balance of detail versus high level first pass?
I think there's something very powerful for having a simple list that has hidden in it complexity. But maybe the idea of kind of reversing what you have is a way of doing it, because I actually thought your presentation here was a little bit clearer than the paper, because it was already, you're clearly trying to fit it onto a slide, and I think that made it a little bit more approachable. But 5 rules of equitable mobility planning, and then you can detail.
them.
I think in general that usually works best.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Does anyone in the audience have any? Yes.
First, I want to congratulate you guys. You did a marvelous job, so congratulations. I have a question about, as Blair brought up, the aging of transit systems. So we not only do they cost a lot, they hardwire in a lot of systems, and communities change over time. And so the question is, how do you help communities think of solutions as the communities are changing? So if a community is aging out and the existing transit systems don't work, how do you build in a process in which you're thinking about equity issues as these systems age?
I'll get us started. I think one of the issues is until now, we've really thought about mobility infrastructure as fixed. And therefore, there hasn't been a lot of flexibility. There has been, we talk about accessibility, there has been going back and retooling access, not just to new systems that are being built, but to existing systems. There's some of that that's been possible. But I think we're on the verge of a new era in mobility in which we may not be wrapping ourselves around fixed assets in quite the same way. And therefore, part of planning in the future should be predicated on the ability to retool. And, obviously nobody's going to rebuild the New York City subway. But in thinking about, for example, and I don't have an answer for this, and I'm not trying to criticize anyone, but the need for people to move between Brooklyn and Queens, maybe a fixed rail streetcar isn't the best way given to address that problem, given the new technologies that are coming on board, which perhaps will prove themselves to be more flexible. But I think we're right on the cusp of a major change in mobility. And if we think about it in advance, maybe that can be much more flexible for the future.
I could just add a thought to that, or two small thoughts to that. The first is there's so much we don't know about how our societies are going to develop, but there are things we do know that we just don't take into consideration, like aging, and we can look at what our demands are going to be in terms of people with disabilities, just because of the overall disease burden of our societies and where that's going and what those trends are. So there are a lot of things we can plan for, or urbanization in other countries where that's happening rapidly and it's probably not going to stop. And the second thing I was saying, it might sound a little goofy, but I've been looking at Taiwan a lot recently. And what's so striking about their model is that in the early 90s, they started these community-based approaches for making decisions. And it really picked up after a natural disaster and the national recovery. It really institutionalized that approach. And I would say community engagement in a meaningful way in planning processes, not just town halls, but really having members of the community as part of planning committees where they're talking about how they engage with a system, I think can be really useful over time for ensuring you're planning for all members of an evolving community.
Yeah. So another question, and I failed to mention that this is being video recorded, so all questions are on the record. But Jacob?
Jacob Mason from the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. First off, I'd like to thank you for a really interesting presentation about equity. It's a very complicated issue. My question has to do with the actual use of your recommendations. It seems to me like the implementation of policy is only as good as the policymakers' intentions. And so do you see this more as an educational tool for policymakers, or do you see this as kind of something that can be applied kind of as is? My concern is that people might take a checklist and do the bare minimum to achieve consideration and then check the box and move on.
So that's the biggest fear. I think that's one of the things that came out as one of the biggest gaps, which is even in multi-criteria analysis, you tend to give weights as you see the goals defined by yourself, like policymakers define their own goals. What we try to do, which is the reason that this is so comprehensive, is if this were instituted as either part of a company policy, for example, if Toyota did enforce this checklist for everything, or if this becomes part of due process at a transport department, then perhaps this is something that can be applied across the board. We do go into a lot of discussion about trade-offs because it seems like, of course, if we have to include every single thing, costs will rise a lot. And we recommend some ways to do it. So target the widest inequities. So you shouldn't have red flags on any of the widest inequities where, say, the gender disparity is not too much. If that's not something that's explicitly addressed, it may be okay. But we have gone into some discussion about how a minimum requirements could be enforced.
Yeah, and I'll comment on that as well. I mean, you're absolutely right. People having the checklist isn't in and of itself the answer. Right? You still have to have people who are committed to working through it in a dedicated way. I know when we engaged on this project, it was to allow us to have a more meaningful structure to engage with our partners to say, are you going through the right things? So I can only speak to us. We intend to use this in the way that you hinted at, in a more robust way, and use it as a way to engage in a dialogue with the governments and NGOs that we work with on these large-scale projects. And that was really the motivation behind it. Let me turn it back to the panel then with another question. Something else that was brought up was this idea you touched on as part of the gentrification issue or even the broader issues, right? As you do things, you induce a change. So we can measure things the way they are now, and you brought up the important point of also trying to measure what we don't know about what people aren't doing but maybe should be doing. But can we dig in a little further of how do we balance these things and think about the inducements that we're going to cause as we create equity? We make investments, we create access, it creates changes in landform, it creates changes in mobility patterns. What is the right time frame to think about this, and how broad, and just some additional thoughts and commentary on that, because I think it's something that is often underappreciated and not easy to necessarily grasp, because we end up solving the problem today and creating the next problem for tomorrow. Anyone want to touch that third rail?
Let me try to make an observation about a very specific case, and then maybe that'll prompt some ideas. I don't know how many of you know the original plan for the Metro, but there was no green line running through 14th and U. There was an offshoot that would have run from about where the Washington Hilton is on Connecticut Avenue over to 14th and U, and that would have been it. And the community and the DC government really lobbied very hard to have the Green Line built as a major trunk line through what was then a poor neighborhood as a way of connecting poor people to jobs elsewhere in the area. By the time it was built, people's attitudes towards the city was beginning to change, and the Green Line became a driver, not the only driver, but a driver for gentrification. And I think this is exactly the point, that you can't always predict what's going to happen. We can give maybe public officials a pass on the Green Line. It was planned and built at a time when DC was desperate for any investment at all, and nobody could imagine that what happened would happen. But now we can imagine, and the next line we plan for, we should think about some of the issues you all raised about controlling for equity around transit stops. We now have enough experience to understand that this is actually an issue we need to think through. So I think, I actually thought your report was very good on some of these issues about the need to, maybe we can't go back and change what's already been done, but we can learn lessons.
So I got a question. Apparently we have a lot of commonality in names from one of my colleagues, Colleen Casey, not Claire Casey. She raises this question of this major challenge is the values inherent in measuring or assessing the widest inequities. And she points out that some may be small gaps, but lead to wide gaps in quality of life or other impacts. So what are your thoughts? Do we need another set of indicators which link the consequences of the outcomes of the different areas, or another way to think about it? How do we tie that in, or is this included in the existing framework? Or is this something that we need to note as yet another complicating factor? Maybe Antonia or Lubna?
Sure. So yeah, our equity checklist right now, as we said, is a basic set of questions that is trying to cover as much as possible, but of course, not everything can be covered. So talking about these trade-offs and other consequences that can follow, I guess sometimes probably it's the question of uncertainty. So you can't really predict the future, and it's really hard to measure this. So for this, I would personally recommend probably like using a more complex system, like for example, like creating an Excel or like software tool where you then can a little bit more detailed tries to take data from the present and kind of tries to figure out a future scenarios that could happen and consequences that could come from that.
Thank you. Anyone else want to? Yeah, go ahead.
What we do push for a lot in the report is the need for conducting baselines and needs assessments. So this is something that we envision that happens either before any transit system is placed and for a transit system that is in place. So ideally, a new baseline when you're planning a new intervention will help to identify any changes that have taken place since. So that could be one way.
Professor Heskett.
Jonathan Haskett with the ERE program. First of all, great presentation and really excellent work on this Practicum project. I guess my question is a little bit unfair because it sort of goes a bit more upstream. And I would say that in some instances, the equity issues are actually reflections of the equity issues in the society, and that it's really an upstream question before you get down to, a transit question. For example, in Wisconsin at the moment, there's a move by the legislature to cut the social safety net by instituting onerous work demands. And the rationale for this is that there has been a great upsurge in tech jobs, that people should just be able to go and get jobs, and that'll be fine, and if they don't, well, it's because they don't want to. Except that the tech jobs are in a corridor external to the city of Milwaukee, and there isn't really an effective way for people who live in poor neighborhoods in Milwaukee to get there. But there is no voice saying that in the legislative process. So perhaps for some of the transportation equity issues, the leverage point is the legal challenge to voter suppression, or the registration of and organizing of large numbers of low-income people so that they become a political force which can then insist precisely in the way that the Green Line with its various consequences happened, that these things be part of the discussion.
Yeah,
I agree, but I would also say that a lot of bad stuff happens unintentionally. And this more effectively can address those issues. And I'm someone who spends all her day doing research and looking at reports, but I think data is powerful. And to me, the most powerful thing here was, we have laws that require environmental impact assessments for certain types of projects. Why don't we have laws that require for certain types of projects some sort of baseline equity analysis? Because having that knowledge, why don't we have studies on gun control, right? Because that information has power. So, to me, the most powerful thing here is actually the generation of data that can back up understanding the trade-offs we're making, even if then the overall political system and society chooses to be inequitable. It'd be a lot harder.
So that gets back to maybe my previous question on indicators, right? So what we're hearing then maybe is there's absolutely a need for a complementary set of indicators. Is that a fair statement, or should we yes or no, or what should those be, or how should we think about incorporating those in? Again, some of this is subjective, but is there some minimal baseline that is a complement to the work that we have in this report?
I think the report already hints in the direction of indicators, and whether or not this is the moment to think about it, I'll leave to all of you. But I think you could take your report and very easily, not easily, but in theory, you could take your report and define indicators under many of the observations.
Yeah.
Any other comments or thoughts? Anything from the panel that you'd like to share? Yes, please.
Jim Sang, retired. We've been talking largely about the, quote, large-scale projects and things like that. But in the real world, a lot of effort goes into bandages, trying to improve things. improving terminals, improving the transition from the train station to the local bus and things like that. And do the same criteria, what you talked about, apply pretty well to bandages as well as to big digs?
I think some aspects apply better than others. In a lot of the aspects, we cover network design and system design. So there, the bandages would just be extending it to areas that don't have anything. But apart from that, there are improvements to station and, I guess, vehicle design that form parts of some of the analysis, like in gender and safety especially. We also cover it in accessibility, where we talk about trip quality. But most of these have to do with how it's implemented, and these, basically, we don't know how relevant it is to include it in the planning stage.
Go ahead, Jacob, again.
Sorry to keep talking, but just to piggyback on that, it seems like the discussion about indicators is really important to bake equity into how a city is growing and changing more generally, because often equity can be getting worse, even though you're not doing any specific big project or even a set of small projects. Each on their face might have maybe not necessarily a direct and bad equity impact, but put together over a long term, you can be heading down a bad path and not even know it. So I think this idea of baking this into large scale analysis makes a lot of sense.
Also, that data is important is a really good point, because the push for a baseline is kind of to establish that data. If there's a spatial mapping and you know that there are these areas that just don't have transit access, or there's this concentration of a certain category of job in one region that doesn't have transit access, it's something that people in the population can lobby for if there is the data available.
Yeah. Great. No, I know we've got about 10 minutes more before I think we have to vacate the room, but that could also be used to have some direct conversations afterwards. So maybe I'll just shift it see if there's any closing thoughts from any of the panel members or the team that did the work, and then we'll wrap it up and continue the discussion perhaps over some coffee.
I would just say you did a great job, and I think you should write an article or an op-ed calling for this stuff.
You know any journals or that might be able to host such an op-ed?
Well, I'll go even further. I mean, I think when I read the report, I thought, wouldn't it be really interesting if not just public agencies, but private groups that are involved in transit planning begin to raise these issues with public agencies? And I think, this is a project which has produced a set of recommendations that need to get out into the world and have an influence and grow.
Any closing thoughts?
Well, from our side, big thank you for everyone for coming today, and we also highly appreciate your feedback on our report, because as right now we're kind of like in the doing the final draft and are very happy to get feedback on it and to know where we can improve or not, and where we should shift our focus. So also in this process, as I said, feedback is always welcome. Apart from that, I guess we're
That's all.
pretty
Just
good.
thank you to
Yeah.
everyone that helped
Very
us
much.
along the way.
Well, one final word. We will be making this report that has been referenced several times available through the Toyota Mobility Foundation website. So I encourage everyone towards the end of May, give us a little time to get it prepped and posted to take a look at it and freely share. To have the impact we want, it's about making this information accessible, and the work that was done certainly rises to that level of being impactful and usable and useful. So again, thank you to Lubna and Antonia for their commitment and work over the semester, and the faculty and the university for being a good partner on this project. So thank you everyone for your time, and I'll look forward to continuing the conversation down on the floor in a moment.